Good afternoon and welcome to day 5 of the Auroville Festival. And when we started off, we mentioned that the first 4 days we will be exploring each aspect of the mother which has been done. From day 5 to day 8, we will be exploring how the aspirational aspect of this can be embodied, can be actually lived and debated and discussed. So today we will be exploring what's this aspiration of the deep comprehension of the power of Maheshwari. How can that which is embedded in knowledge becomes a living wisdom in each one of us? Which aspects of integral education need to be strengthened in Auroville? Because one of the aspects that we're looking is how do we really live in this in Auroville? But it's also looking at that Auroville is an example of for human unity in humanity. It can be looked across as an integral educational aspect across the world. To pursue the path of uneducation and constant progress and a community of youth that never ages. So welcome to each one of you, and I'm going to invite Nilima to give a very brief description of each one of you for the benefit of our audience to look at the diversity of the experience that we have. And I understand this is a huge topic. It's very deep as well. But what we will try and look and explore is the integrality of the aspect and the living application of it. Yeah? So I'm going to start off with, like we talked about it, is a lifelong learning, right? And the lifelong learning is an aspect of the sincerity in the mind, or let's say sincerity in the being. And we have explored what does sincerity really mean. But there is also in an aspect where the mind can dupe oneself, right? There's a tendency of the mind to always give another layer or another layer of interpretation. So man's nature, especially in his mental nature, has a spontaneous tendency to give a favorable explanation for everything that he thinks, feels, says, or does. How does one really even work with this obstacle, if I can use the word as that? So Aurevan, the fact that you've been a child of Auroville, you've grown up and you teach, in your experience, how does one really work with this nature, the mental nature, where giving an explanation is easy, but the ability to step back and the ability to look at this nature and therefore pursue a lifelong learning that is deeply integral, that is deeply synthesizing the several aspects of what true education is. What are your thoughts or feelings or your experiences of this?
So I guess it would start with just the awareness, the knowing, really the knowing, the psychological understanding that the mind does dupe itself all the time. Because I think a lot of the time we have a sense, if there's a certain aspiration to wish to be truthful, to wish to be sincere, we have the sense that we are sincere. But then there are parts of us that are a little hidden from ourselves. There are ways in which, if we have especially a good mind, a good argumentative mind, we can argue pretty much anything. There's a character called Cardinal Richelieu. He was a pretty frightening church fellow. He's said to have said in his time, "Give me 5 words, any 5 words a man says, and I can hang him." It's not a very joyful way to start this conversation, but the point is the mind can argue anything. So, to come back a few years ago, as you asked, my experience growing up here as well, when I was, I think, around age 13, 14, I remember sitting at this little bench at school. I was looking out into the garden, and there was a little bit of trouble brewing around Auroville, like it might be trouble brewing a little bit now. And, 14-year-old, a little bit upset at how people were treating each other, the way they were behaving, and I could not understand for the life of me how it was possible that individuals who had at some point in their life made this choice, made this commitment to come here, left everything, whether they're from right next door or all the way across the world, left everything to dive into this experiment. How if that was the starting point, how could they, the they that was all surrounding, be treating each other this way and behaving this way, which was petty and incomprehensible for me. And I was angry, really angry, because what do you do as a 14-year-old? Nobody's going to listen to you much. And what did I know any more than anybody else? And I remember sitting on that bench, and it hit me. I kept saying they in my mind. So, but wait, that could be me. You know, I was so full of this burning aspiration. And I said, wait, that really can be me. For me, that was a frightening moment. And the question then that ensued, and I think that was the beginning of my whole journey, and deepening into education at least, but journey also of my own yoga, of my own sadhana, was what if that can be me? And it can at any moment. We're made of the same stuff. Then what is the safeguard? Is there a safeguard? And if so, how do I begin to live that and to practice that on a daily basis? So I churned and churned and churned, and the safeguard that came was sincerity. But not just the surface sincerity. I mean, this kind of burning sincerity. The sincerity to look within and to say, you know what, this I don't want to look at. And to say, okay, I'm not ready to look at that. But at least I know there's something in me I don't want to look at. And I think that at an individual level, that was the beginning of that journey, and it still is the same journey on a daily basis. Working with teenagers, because that's the age group I like to work with, is developing that capacity, exactly like you said, to step back. To step back. And we have, I guess, over time, developed all sorts of little methods, methodologies that can help to do that. But I think a young child and a teenager, because a teenager, it's that age where you're forming yourself, really. You're starting to figure out who you are, or at least who you're not. There is more openness to questioning oneself than when we start to rigidify into adults. And this is where I find it tricky. Because one can find a certain, I mean, you look at little kids, there's an honesty, there's a sincerity of attitude. When they're in the moment, they're wholly in the moment, and when they're not, you know it. And with teenagers, that is a moment that can begin to veil itself, where one can start to tell ourselves, we can tell ourselves lies, we tell each other lies, but especially ourselves. And if at that phase of adolescence, one can find another hook. And I tell my students, my kids, I don't care what you tell the world. At this point, that's not the point of focus. But at least to yourself. Know when there's an insincerity. Acknowledge it. You don't need to fix it. Acknowledge it. Put it somewhere. Deal with it when you're ready to deal with it. Because these insincerities, I mean, they come up with, if we're looking at integral education, we're looking at the body, we're looking at the vital, we're looking at the mind in terms of instruments. All of it ought to be centered around the psychic. How do we touch upon that? And isn't that the sincerest part of ourselves? And if we can start to touch that through a certain capacity for practice from the youngest age onwards, and if that continues through teenage, through adolescence, a 19, 20-year-old who has the capacity to go inward and touch this, those moments of difficulties are that little bit shorter. Because they know that regardless of the mud they're rolling in, there's something else. And that needs to be sustained past childhood. It needs to go into adolescence.
Thank you for sharing that. But the thought that comes to my mind right now is it's an endeavor to build this capacity, to create that space, to also acknowledge that it's okay that you feel insincere, but if you don't want to deal with it, you park it and come to it when you're ready. That works when I'm sitting with myself, but I'm also a part of a collective. A collective that at times influences you, or pressurizes you, or asks you to confirm or conform. For whatever reasons, because while we can build with young children and the youth, as adults who carry impressions and who are working still those impressions, it takes time. And that's probably my little example of working with the world outside. How do you deal with that when the interaction with you is safe, or maybe with people that they feel that they can feel safe with, But when they go into spaces where the safety is either questioned, or it feels it's going to be destabilized, or it feels like it's a voice that I don't know I can voice it, I can trust the voice as well, and I neither. How does one deal with that, and as a lifelong learning process? And interestingly, I would love to ask Uday is that one of the introduction was given is that you teach critical thinking skills. How do they combine with each other?
Should I quickly? All right. I think it's precisely in this. The sincerity is first towards ourselves. And if sincerely I can understand my strengths and weaknesses to begin with, it's very much surface level. It's just the psychological strengths and weaknesses. When I find myself in the outside world that questions that, if I know my strengths, and my strengths are questions, not an issue. If I know my weaknesses, and my weaknesses are questions, all right, I know I need to work on it. It actually puts me a step ahead. And then there's the need, the capacity to be able to keep growing and take criticism that comes in. And double check, because what I might have thought was a strength, usually there's the other aspect, the other side of the coin, which is the weakness of it. But just from that psychological standpoint, we have that capacity of analyzing oneself and analyzing oneself in situations, it gives us an edge the moment we are in a collective, rather than makes us lose that edge.